Hello and welcome to Newswire. This is Ayza Omar. We'll be talking about a case that's doing the rounds here in the United States and getting a lot of media attention across the board. The U.S. Navy Chief Richard Spencer, he's been fired over how he handled the case of a Navy SEAL who was demoted for misconduct. Now, this is the case of Edward Gallagher, who was convicted for posing with a 17-year-old dead Islamic State fighter in Iraq in 2017. And the decision to demote him by the military, that sparked tensions between U.S. President Donald Trump and senior military officials. Now, Gallagher was accused of not just posing with the dead body of the IS fighter, but also stabbing the unarmed prisoner to death. And also, along with that, other accusations of him randomly shooting civilians while serving in Iraq in 2017. He was, however, acquitted of these charges and only convicted of a lesser crime, which was posing with the dead body. Now, the charge essentially translated that he would be demoted, but President Trump intervened and he reinstated his rank. President Trump also pardoned on Friday 2 Army officers, First Lieutenant Clint Lawrence and Major Matthew Goldstein, who were accused of war crimes in Afghanistan. So essentially, does President Trump, with this move, undermine the military justice, the way it operates in the U.S., and it also in turn sends a message across the global battlefield everywhere the U.S. soldiers are involved that war crimes will be tolerated by the U.S. soldiers? To address this and other questions, we will be talking to our guest today. Let me introduce who we have on the line with us. Mr. Kaunert is the Professor of Policing and Security and the Director of the International Center for Policing Security, and he's joining us from London. And also we have with us Mr. Ross Feingold, an analyst joining us from Taipei, Taiwan. Welcome to both of you. I'm going to start right off the bat with you, Mr. Kaunert. There have been, of course, differing accounts of why Richard Spencer was either asked to resign or forced to resign or terminated. But essentially the question here we're trying to address, and I'd like to get your comments on, is the impact this move by U.S. President Donald Trump to intervene in an administrative process. What will that impact be?
Well, I don't want to say too much about the actual case, but what I think is important to outline is that, as you rightly pointed out, by intervening in a case and in a sense getting around the military leadership, by in effect undermining the Navy leadership and the military leadership more generally, President Trump is really seriously undermining the kind of legitimacy and authority and quite possibly also the order that will remain within the navies. So I think he was very mistaken in terms of getting involved in something where he's very clearly not qualified to be discussing or adjudicating. So I think that was a very serious mistake.
So you say it's a serious mistake, and seen from President Trump even following this decision of firing the Navy chief is him sort of congratulating Edward Gallagher, saying that you've been through enough, your family's been through enough. I'm really happy with the good news. I mean, he's retiring now with full honors and benefits, and absolutely no implications of there is enough evidence of war crimes against him. Now, the question obviously isn't really about what the commander-in-chief can do, what President Trump can do, but in fact, the timing of him interfering in this administrative matter in the collective history of the world. What kind of a message is this conveying about the U.S.?
Yes, I mean, very clearly, President Trump is not in sync with his own military leadership. Very clearly, he has disagreed on numerous occasions with his security staff, with his military leadership, with the FBI, with the CIA. It's quite clear that they're not seeing eye to eye. And I think we have a divided United States government. That is very clear.
Those concerns that the decision-making power that the military leaders should have had on such a case, on the plight or the future of the career of one sailor, I mean, is that decision-making power being taken from them?
I wouldn't say that in general it is being taken away from them, but of course their authority is very seriously undermined, because this now gives a kind of a carte blanche to anybody to kind of play up to the gallery and thereby undermine military leadership, which is very, very bad news for any type of military organization. But I think the broader question here is also, how come President Trump gets on so well with various authoritarian dictators around the world, but can't get on on and see eye to eye with his own leadership, with his own military leadership, with his own security services. How come that is possible?
So, Mr. Kaunert, is there a question here which analysts are posing right now around the world, saying that the very sort of moral authority and responsibility of these military leadership is now in question? Will they take a stand against their commander-in-chief in carrying out what should have been due process?
Well, I think the military leadership is already doing what it can. We shouldn't forget that, of course, anybody who stands up to President Trump is very quickly removed. So as a result of that, of course, it is very, very difficult for them to voice their opposition to some of his decisions very, very clearly, openly and loudly. But I think within those constraints, we already see military leadership, in a sense, saying, well, we know how to run an army. We've done this for, centuries, and we've done it pretty well. So please stay out of this.
Is it unprecedented, would you say, the way President Trump has come and interfered in this to protect Edward Gallagher's position, to retain his position in the military? Because considering the kind of stance he's taken on war, the kind of stance he's had on torture, on violence in war? Yes.
I mean, it isn't totally unprecedented that presidents can interfere in individual matters. However, what is unprecedented is the scale of the interference. What is unprecedented is the widespread, in a sense, antagonism towards your own leadership, towards the military chiefs, towards the security services. That is something unprecedented. I don't think any US president has had that type of relationship before.
All right, Mr. Christian Kaunert joining us with his take on the situation, not only how it means for the impact it has across the world. Mr. Feingold, how do you see it, this resignation in itself? If we could just focus on how now this resignation of the Navy chief reflects on the intervention or the kind of interference that President Trump has shown for this particular case.
Well, the resignation of the Secretary of the Navy, as far as we know, just from recent hours and his interview, seems more to be an issue between the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Navy rather than something broader. So as Professor said, I mean, we need to try and separate that out issue from the broader questions of President Trump's intervention. But I would disagree with the professor, and I wouldn't label this as indicative of President Trump undermining the military leadership. The Pentagon, both the uniformed as well as civilians who work there, which is literally many hundreds of thousands of people in the military, whether uniformed or civilians. They know they're professionals, and they know that the president is the commander-in-chief, and this was within his authority. And as we discussed, it's certainly not a precedent. There are precedents for the president of the United States to intervene in specific cases involving service people. So that's not new either. And as far as undermining going forward, we should also keep in mind that these cases obviously are very public. The facts are well known. As you said, this SEAL was acquitted of the most serious charges. So the facts are out there. Then if the public or even people working in the Pentagon disagree with the president's actions, there are things they could do. I mean, the public could vote next year. They could vote out President Trump if they disagree with him or a year away from the election. And people at the Pentagon and the Defense Department, they have the option to resign. And we've only seen one senior person leave in the last couple of days. And again, that seems to be more the result of some personal friction between the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Navy.
Right, but Mr. Feingold, the question essentially here isn't whether the commander-in-chief, can or cannot, what he can or cannot do. It's really essentially how far he is going to go in interfering in these kind of administrative matters, especially where moral authority is being questioned here. Now, this individual, Edward Gallagher, is one of the many who have allegations of war crimes against them. In his case, there were 7 former platoon members who were witnesses to him having openly discharged his firearms at civilians, unarmed civilians. So, I mean, there was a lot going against this man. And to step up and endorse him at a time where already the collective history of the world knows that U.S. soldiers always go, unaccounted for their war crimes. It's really bad timing, isn't it? I mean, there could have been a way to go about this.
Well, what you refer to as timing, one might also say it's the perception around the world, whether it's from allies or countries where the United States does have troops in theater, in fact, on the battlefield, literally at the moment as we speak. But over the past 20 years, as the United States has been involved in conflict in the Middle East and other places around the world fighting terrorism, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sailors and Marines who have been on the front lines. And there's a great support for them in the United States. And again, these individuals, the cases that the president has gotten involved in, the facts are well known. I'm sure years from now, historians will still be talking about these cases and arguing whether or not what President Trump did was justified. Again, I think you're going to see the American public will be broadly supportive, given that these are veterans, they've served, and were willing to put their lives at risk. The facts of their cases are well known, so there will be people who, going forward, will continue to say that these individuals were not deserving of presidential intervention, and they'll have to bear that the rest of their careers, or to the extent they've left the military now, the rest of their lives. The facts are on the internet. We're talking about it on television. So these individuals also cannot avoid the judgment of history as it is, but. As far as the public in the United States, the military, I think generally we're actually going to see broad support for President Trump.
Which is then at the same time concerned, because while he might get national support, for his decision here, it does bring into question whether it matters at all to the U.S. foreign policy, what kind of image they convey to the world, the kind of U.S. credibility that is being questioned here of an individual who has been accused of, where there is enough evidence against him, of murdering in cold blood a teenager, essentially, who was in prison in the first place.
Well, again, we have to keep in mind he was acquitted of those charges, but it's an excellent question, and this is an issue that we shouldn't just put on the United States. So other defense partners or countries where the United States is engaged in hostilities, often at the invitation of the host country government, or where the U.S. has bases and has troops based overseas or at naval bases around the world, this is up to those other countries. If they have an issue with the presence of the U.S. military, well, they could ask them to leave, of course. They could ask to rewrite the agreements, often referred to as status of forces agreements. And sometimes we do see friction with other countries with regard to the U.S. military presence. But this is for other countries' leadership or parliamentarians to raise with the United States, and then we'll see how President Trump and the U.S. government react to those kinds of criticisms.
But Mr. Feingold, it can't be as simple as the governments who are right now in agreements with the U.S. military forces on the ground in their country, supporting them in their war against terror or fighting militancy or terrorism, such as in Afghanistan, what we saw in Iraq, which I think digresses from essentially the narrative that they were there on invitation alone. But I mean, it's not that simple, is it? That they would be asked to leave and they up and leave, leaving behind the question whether any of those soldiers were ever going to be held accountable for their actions on the ground.
Well, again, it's not that simple that they would say you leave, but they do have mechanisms to voice these concerns to the United States. In many cases, again, the U.S. is there by invitation. So there are agreements, there are discussions. They work closely with the militaries as well as the civilian governments of these countries when the United States, whether it's in peace or in war, are on the ground in these countries. So I would say that, yes, these other countries do have a concern. If they have a concern, they could raise it with the United States. And similarly, the U.S. most close defense relationship in Europe is NATO. And we see a lot of friction between the NATO countries and the United States at present. But again, if they have a concern, they should raise it. We've seen, for example, President Macron of France, very critical of President Trump's interactions with NATO. If he's got an issue with how the U.S. military is commanded by the U.S. Commander-in-Chief, President Trump, then they're welcome to raise that, and we'll see how President Trump reacts.
Mr. Ross Feingold there joining us from Taiwan. Thank you so much. We're going to take a quick short break. We'll be back with an update on what is happening with the Syrian Constitutional Committee in Geneva. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, the Syrian Constitutional Committee talks sponsored by the UN in Geneva have come to a standstill as Damascus government delegates walked out. Now, opposition members are saying this is a delaying tactic, but analysts are saying otherwise. This 150-member committee, it had been designed essentially to see political reform in this war-torn country, and there was the hope that with UN supervision, free and fair elections will take place soon. Now, there have been, of course, the war has killed hundreds of thousands of people and forced millions to flee since it started back in March 2011. So we'll be talking to our guests to get an insight into what happens now and whether these talks can and will move forward. Let me introduce who we'll be speaking today. We have with us Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, Syrian Negotiations Commission member. He's joining us from Geneva. He was part of the talks there. Also, he'll give us an oversight into what is happening. Also, let me introduce Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany, a human rights expert and the chairman of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. He's joining us from Doha. We have Mr. Hasasu, a political analyst, joining us from Istanbul, Turkey. Welcome to all three of you. If I could start with you, Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, on the talks, where they stand right now after this walkout by the Damascus delegation.
Yesterday, the regime's delegation left the talks with the excuse that it proposed a schedule for the talks, and it was they said that it was not agreed upon by the other parties, which is actually not the truth at all. According to the rules and procedures of the Constitutional Committee, 72 hours before the talks, any round starts, the joint heads of the delegations are supposed to present schedules. From our side, Mr. Hadi Al-Bahra presented a schedule that talks about the introduction of the Constitution and the basic principles upon which the discussions would be based. Yesterday in the morning, that is not according to the scheduled time, the head of the regime's delegation presented some sort of a statement saying that if the other parties do not agree on what he called the basic patriotic principles, we will not be discussing anything related to the Constitutional Committee, which is a violation of the rules and procedures agreed upon for the committee.
Sorry to interrupt. Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, this basic patriotic principles, what essentially is that?
Well, first, the nature of the country, the politics of the country, how it is going to be shaped, what concerns it, what needs to be referred to in terms of its politics, in terms of its economy, rights, responsibilities. That is the basic content of Constitution. This is what we presented. And they wanted to talk about terrorism, and every Syrian has suffered from terrorism, and I don't think that this is the right place for this to be included in the Constitution. They talk about condemning the Turkish invasion. Everybody condemns any foreign interference in Syria, and they talk about lifting of sanctions. Also, all Syrians do not want sanctions to be imposed. So they talk about what is known, and this is not part of talking about a constitution.
So what they didn't want to talk about, you're suggesting, is whether the amendment of the Constitution needed or a whole new Constitution is needed. They evaded the topic. On that pretext, they walked out.
this is part of their tactics for blocking the work of the Constitutional Committee, to which they were dragged under the pressure of the Russians. This is exactly what is happening. They are trying to find ways in order to obstruct the work of the committee. And this is one of their tactics. They come late. Last time they came late, and they shortened the time of meetings. They are not serious at all on writing a constitution that would bring Syria back to life. This is what they are concerned about, is the keeping of their regime. Mm-hmm. And what we are concerned about is the 23 million Syrians. This is the difference. And they are trying to block the work of the committee.
So what happens now, Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi? Are the talks over now, or is there going to be backdoor negotiations, try to get them back on board to continue this? This is, after all, the second round. I mean, is there any hope for these negotiations to go further?
Yes, today is supposed to be the second day of this round. Mm-hmm. And we are now, in a few minutes, heading towards the UN. Hopefully, they would understand that these things that they are trying to present are the best prescription for blocking the work of the committee. We are trying to create some sort of compromise. Well, you want to talk about these things? Fine. But let them be considered something present in articles to be included as supplementary ones. When a constitution talks about the administrative authority, talks about legal matters, legislation. It talks about the authority of the president, a prime minister, centralism, non-centralism, talks about rights. These are the issues that should be included in a constitution, not talking about political matters. Political matters have another tract in Resolution 2254. If they want that, we are ready to open it. But the ultimate goal of what they are doing is to obstruct the work of the committee, because they felt that they were obliged to come into these talks by the Russians, who are responsible for protecting the regime. This is it, clear and truthful.
Okay, Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, best of luck for the talk ahead as you head off to the UN now in Geneva for these constitutional committees sit together and finally come to some kind of terms and conditions. Thank you for joining us, taking out the time. Let me come to you, Mr. Jan Hasasu. How do you see what Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi is part of this constitutional committee, how he's been explaining this? Do you agree with this being essentially the Syrian regime's delaying tactics in not coming to the point, which is right now to be addressed, the constitution itself?
It obviously looks like that, and as the Mr. Spokesman mentioned, the Syrian regime is talking about stuff which has to be talked about later on. At the process of writing the constitution, the Syrian people needs to see really solid steps towards that. And it's very basic, simple. The Syrian regime and the opposition, together with the civil, the other civil rights society members, they are gathered here to write the constitution, which opens the path in front of a new Syria, to open the way for a solution in Syria, and that is after reestablishing the country and taking the country step by step to an election that makes the Syrian people to decide what kind of country they want. This is that simple, but the Syrian regime seems to be trying to gain some time in order to stop this process or slow this process. In previous peace talks, like in Geneva, we've witnessed the regime putting more force on the ground during the negotiations to put pressure on the opposition party. But now it seems like the regime doesn't have the power on the ground to really push the opposition in Syria, but instead they are trying to gain some time on the table with these kind of maneuvers. And I don't see the Syrian regime being serious about it, since they know it goes to the Syrian regime. They are trying to protect the Syrian regime with these kind of political maneuvers.
But Mr. Hasasu, how far can they keep doing this? End of October, we saw the first round of these talks began, and these are UN-sponsored talks. And as Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi has also mentioned, there's a lot of pressure from the Russian side. I mean, they're supporting Bashar al-Assad. And when they go ahead and make these moves, the Syrian government, these delaying tactics, how far do you think they can take this until finally something has to be done?
Well, it's pretty much related to what's going on the field. There are negotiations or talks between the Russians and Turks and maybe with the Iranians with Syrians, and who knows, maybe the Syrian regime with SDF and other groups on the ground. So it is really dependent on we are going to see in the field within the next couple of days or weeks, maybe. But the Syrian regime will try to gain as much as time for themselves, no matter what will be the result of these efforts. So it doesn't have to be, gaining some specific amount of time for some target. The Syrian regime actually doesn't have anything else to do right now except trying to do what they couldn't on the field, on the table right now. And it looks like they are trying to stop and slow the process.
There have been, by some very conservative estimates, 370,000 people, Syrians who have lost their lives in this, in this Syrian war, upwards of 570 by some estimates. Over 6 million people have become refugees. But when we see this kind of an outcome of an important constitutional committee meeting where the government walks out or employs delaying tactics, the opposition groups and the civil society groups who are part of this panel in Geneva right now, they must be really angry.
I think that this path will lead to nothings. This is just a game, as Bashar al-Assad said. And I think that the opposition is totally wrong to engage with this path, actually. As you mentioned, there is no timetable at all. They might reach to the draft of constitution, but maybe after unlimited years, maybe after 10 years, Bashar al-Assad will be elected again in 2022. So that similar to what's happened in Geneva process. Why is that? The process of drafting the constitution is more important than the constitution result itself. That's how we learn the constitution law. The constitution usually drafted when the conflict ended and after negotiation by the parties. Then they sit on the table and start writing the draft of constitution. On contrary, what's happened in Syria, the conflict is still firing. 3 days ago, Bashar al-Assad is shelled IDP camps in Al-Qa. And yesterday and today he's seizing more territories and villages from Idlib, West Syria, torturing people. So crimes against humanity and war crimes are still exist. The conflict are still exist. How we are sitting with this regime and some part of the opposition and fake, actually, those the most of this organization are fake organization, which is some of them actually linked to the Assad security forces group. Some of them are fake organization or individuals, and they give them this term, civil society, which is actually not true at all. Those are gathered and collected from everywhere to say that, but we are the civil society are monitoring what's going on. And we issued 2 reports, actually. One report at the first round of this which alleged constitution committee. And we mentioned how many civilians is killed by Assad regime and how many war crimes are committed. And we are monitoring and doing the same, the same things for this round to actually reveal that this path will lead to nothings.
But Mr. Ghany, isn't it too much to expect that a ceasefire of sort or, a holding off by all of those involved, whether it is not just the Syrian regime, but also the foreign forces involved there, Russia, Turkey, to hold off on everything until the Constitutional Committee comes together with a plan? I mean, isn't that too far off to expect as a possibility?
A smart question, actually. But now we are talking about two parties who is engaged in this process, which is one party is the Syrian regime. So that we are requesting from those parties, and the other party is the opposition. Now we are not talking about others, for example, the Russian or SDF. Now we are monitoring those violations from those parties, which they should stop actually. Which doesn't actually. Assad regime didn't reveal the fate of thousands of disappeared, which they are still in his center detention. So without this actually process, that will lead to nothing. The second important issue is actually, and I think the opposition is dreaming actually. What Dr. Yahya, with full of respect, this is just a dreaming. Drafting a constitution without removing hundreds of injustice law, which still exists in Syria, that lead to nothing actually. So that our request is a transitional body. This transitional body have the authority to draft the constitution and also to change the injustice law, the law which is hundreds of law, which is against the human rights law, which exist and protected the Assad security forces, protected Assad law. That's the most important, and that I think the opposition, it might be absent from this argument, or they are but they are also want to play a role, or they want to engage in spite of this.
No, but Mr. Ghany, who would make that transitional? Who would consist of that transitional government? Who could be possibly placed in that position? Who would be? That's essentially taking the Syrian regime into account for their atrocities. I mean, who would be able to do that in Syria at this point?
I think a very important question again. Let me refer to all of the Security Council resolution, to Geneva 1, Resolution 2118, 2254. None of them actually refer to Constitutional Committee. From where this idea is created? From Sochi conference, which is taken care by Russia. So this is the reference of the Constitution Committee. Then actually the UN is engaged. But all of those resolutions, and Geneva 1 also, all of them referring to transitional body. The opposition should reject actually this process and path, which is leading to nothing. It's actually, as I mentioned, should be transitional body, lead to a constitutional committee, and lead to election committee, and have the authority actually, the authority to also changing the injustice law, and also have the authority to monitor the election. All of the authority will be in this transitional body. Otherwise, now Constitution Committee without actually legitimate reference. Who's the reference for this committee committee actually?
So, Mr. Ghany, Mr. John Hasasu, what role could the Turks play here, the Russians could play here in getting Bashar al-Assad essentially to come to the negotiation table and then to agree to back off, considering that he's finally in a position where he's recaptured a lot of land that he had lost back a few years ago, 2015?
Well, actually, Mr. Ghany made very good technical points about the talks, and he's really right to say that. But I think, as he mentioned as well, the opposition is trying to gain some time and plus some attention to its problem, and it doesn't want to be the part which hides from these kind of efforts, and it continues to be present there and to represent the Syrian people and the opposition. Turkey, at the other side, from the beginning, is against the Syrian regime and Assad's regime, to be specific. And Turkey is against Assad because the people, the opposition, doesn't want to be under the rule of Assad or his Ba'ath regime in this country anymore. So they will continue to support this demand of the Syrian people, and they have been pushing for this in their talks with the Russians and the Iranians. But I think before talking to the Syrian regime, Turkey is going to try to find a solution to the problem with the Russians and the Iranians, and I think this is a step but it's not the whole path or the solution to the problem. But we will continue to talk about the matter since we don't have any clear indication of these talks between Turkey and Russia and Iran, fresh talks, I mean.
Right.
But I expect fresh talks on this problem in the upcoming days.
Right, but Mr. Hasasu, I understand that there is a lack of clarity at the moment with so much going on, but at the same time, I mean, we're seeing how Russia is reacting to the suggestions from Turkey of a new offensive. I mean, they're not very confident that this might be the right solution at this point, because a big question on what would happen to those areas in the buffer zone? Who's taking control of it? There is a lot of resistance on the ground from those who have been displaced from here in northeast Syria about the regime coming back and taking power. So isn't this an opportunity where Turkey can play that role to not just clear out the area of YPG, but also impose a kind of a pressure point on the Syrian regime to cede?
Turkey's foreign policy is based on creating consensus between its allies, neighbors, or the parties in this founding solution efforts. And it's trying to be not aggressive, but cooperating with the situation and try to not give more harm to the region after it went through all these years. So in this term, Turkey is trying to make the other side, the Iranians and the Russians, to really agree on its thesis. And I think Turkey will continue to insist on its demands. Iran is in a different position these days. Wherever Iranian influence is strong, like Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and including Iran mainland itself, there are problems. And these problems actually will have an effect on the Iranian side of this deal. So I think within the upcoming days, we will see clear steps taken by the Turkish authorities or together with the Russians about solving the problem. But it doesn't mean that Turkey is giving up from its efforts to solve the problem, specifically inside Syria.
Right. And Mr. Ghany, since running out of time, last question to you. I want to put in a lot here. I want to also acknowledge that there have been protests here going on in northeastern Syria by the displaced people for weeks now on end, protesting the Syrian regime's presence back in places which were first controlled by the YPG. Now, that having been said, what's your take on, given the condition on the ground, the kind of sort of futility of this Constitutional Committee meeting in Geneva? Can Turkey play that positive role in bringing Bashar al-Assad to a point where he is forced to negotiate and speak with the opposition groups?
I think that the role of Turkey is very huge, and the influence is positive influence in the Syria conflict, and I think they can do much better in this regard, especially with the negotiation with the Russian, because like the negotiation with the Russian is difficult, as Russian forces still support totally the Assad crimes and committed also as the New York Times investigation and our investigation continue to attack the hospitals and the medical centers. I think that those crimes actually the main reason of the IDP, the main reason of the refugees, the people still terrifying. More negotiation with Russian and pressure in this regard actually with getting support from the Syrian population, which is like against those behavior from Russian and also some European country and the US. I think that we can change these rules. Finally, this process actually, the Constitution Committee, Assad is create the constitution in 2012, and the aim of that to give him legitimacy again. Who is admit this constitution is Iranian and Russian only. Now this process will give Assad legitimacy with care from the UN and from the several. Actually, this is the dangerous of this process actually. Without taking care that this process will lead and end this security forces ruling in Syria and Assad Authority, that will lead to nothing actually. IDP still will never go back to their houses, the refugees as well.
Right.
Yeah, of course, totally. We have a report actually what they faced when they go back. Torture disappeared again. Recruiting them. So
it's a difficult balance, essentially, how the Constitutional Committee meeting goes ahead, because one has to also keep in mind the kind of powers that be might just reinforce the presence of the Syrian regime in the war-torn Syria. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. I had to cut you there, Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany, but thank you so much for joining us. Also you, Mr. Jan Hasasu. And with that, we've come to the end of the program. We will be back tomorrow with more analysis on the latest happenings around the world.